Welcome weirdos! Today we're going to be doing the August wrap-up. I am so excited. Well, first of all, because I'm sharing my books that I've read this month with you, but also because I went to the local library around here and I got the library card, which means that I have access to a lot more audiobooks than I did at my local library. I also do have Audible, but I save Audible for the books that I can't find anywhere. I feel like I need to put this disclaimer in all of my videos. Sometimes forget to put it in or forget to say it. It's not my intention to mispronounce things, but it's just inevitable because I can't decode things. So again, I apologize for not pronouncing things right. Moving on. This is kind of a really weird video for me because this basically marks my 2-month anniversary kind of here on BookTube, and that's just like July's wrap-up. I'm going to try and do this in chronological order, in order of how I read them. I'm filming this on the 31st of July, so let's get going. The first book I read this month is My Own Words by Ruth Bader Ginsburg with Mary Harriet and Wendy W. Williams. And this technically isn't the first book I read this month. I'm counting it because the other one was Artemis and I already talked about it. I really liked this. As I said, I'd read part of the way through it last fall. I finally got back to sitting down with this and reading this, and I really liked it. I'm gonna give this a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads because I thought it was a really good book, but one thing that I had a major issue with it kept telling the same stories over and over, and to be fair, this is a collection of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's speeches, dissents, and other writings of hers. So in a lot of her speeches, she gives lots of the same examples. So as you're listening to one speech for one thing, you're like, oh yeah, that's really cool. And then a couple chapters later, she'll use the same example, but it's a different speech being given to someone else. And you're like, we already heard of this. Okay, and that's kind of unavoidable. Overall, it's really good. This book is a collection of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's writings, speeches, and things written about her. So it's really cool in that retrospect, and a lot of times when it's a specific speech that she gave, they'll use the actual recording of it. A lot of her dissents are in there, so it's really cool to actually hear the audio of her speaking. I love Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's one point where her husband Marty gives a speech, and that's really, really cool to hear too. The thing with this is that there's actually an opera written about her and about her relationship with Antonin Scalia. The entire libretto for the opera is in here, but in the audiobook, you only hear part of it. I listened to this on audio and followed along with this book. That's typically how I really like to read books. I would recommend that if you want to read this book, read it with the audiobook, because that is a really cool experience because you actually get to hear her talking and other people talking rather than just reading what she wrote. If you're going to read the audiobook and follow along, that might get a little tricky because the audiobook doesn't follow word for word this actual book. Little things just didn't match up slightly, and that kind of started to grade on me a little bit. It would only be really at the beginnings of chapters and the endings of chapters, because typically the chapter was her entire speech. Like there was one instance when she was giving a speech to introduce someone, and in the book it says, then she welcomed this lady up on the stage. And that's not in the audiobook. And for the opera, we only got snippets of the opera. I listened to this audiobook at 2x speed. When I got to the opera section, I was like, why do they all sound funny? They just sound really funny. Their vibratos aren't doing what the vibrato should be doing. And then I realized, oh, that's because it's on 2x speed, not 1x speed, you doofus. And like most books, it does have pictures in it, and they're really cool to see. Yeah, that's my opinions about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I really liked it. 4 out of 5. Would recommend this, but on audio, I think it's a real treat to actually hear the stuff. The second book I read this month is Educated by Tara Westover, and this book is about Tara Westover and her quest to be educated, and goes through a lot of her childhood and what it was like to be raised by this very doomsday prepper Mormons. This was a little bit different than I thought it would be. I knew it was going to talk about her getting educated, but I thought it would dive more into she grew apart from the beliefs, specifically her father's belief. She doesn't really go into how that really hurt her, if that makes any sense. I thought that it would talk mostly about the emotional and psychological abuse that she kind of went through, but it was really surprising where the actual abuse came from. Most of it was from one of her older brothers that she thought she had a really good relationship with. Talks about how she just would put it in the back of her head and would just say like, oh no, he never meant to hurt me. This is just X, Y, and Z for why he's doing it. It really saddened me to read. He was able to get away with it. This brother of hers abused all of his younger siblings and his wife and his children. Her parents take the side of her brother and don't really want to report it to the police. She confronts him and it gets really, really violent. He sends her lots of death threats and threatens her with a knife. And she states at the end of the book that she basically has a really broken relationship with her family. She hopes it can get better one day. I know that it can be hard to confront your abuser and then even harder to report it to the police. And it just is really sad to me that that did not happen in this case, because in my opinion, I think she deserves justice. Her sister deserves justice. Her entire family that was abused deserves justice. And I understand it is a complicated situation because it is her brother. She finds solace when she reaches out to one of her other brothers and confides in him, and she was really nervous that he was going to reject her. And he was like, yeah, no, he was my brother too. I think I'm going to give this a 4 out of 5. I think it was good. I think it was interesting. There's a section where they're trying to get birth certificates for her and some of her siblings, and just the amount of calls that they had to go on to, and it was her mom who did it, having to call like the government trying to get these kids birth certificate. I can't imagine what that'd be like, trying to get documentation and proof that you existed. It was cover that I thought was really cool, but if you look really close, those black flecks are like birds. I thought that that was really cool, and it's a nice little touch. Also, I found her struggle with going to college and trying to reconcile her beliefs that she had been fed by her father and been indoctrinated all of her life to believe, and then confronting like with her roommates and other Mormons, people who were good people in her eyes, but did A, B, and C that in her father's view would make them evil and not real Mormons. I thought this was really well written. I really liked the writing style in this. I read this with audiobook and following along, and that was really nice, and I thought the audiobook was good. I'm gonna give this a 4 out of 5. It was a good book. It was fine. I don't think it's as good as everyone is telling me. I was kind of going into this with different expectations than what I got, and I felt like that's always kind of a little bit disappointing. It was still good. It's not a bad book. I just wish that this book had focused on a slightly different angle. The next book that I read this month is Before the Dawn, Recovering the Lost History of Our Ancestors by Nicholas Wade. And I have been wanting to read this basically since I got it, but I have been waiting because I knew that there was an audiobook, and I looked on the Cincinnati Overdrive system and they had it, and I was like, well, I guess I'm gonna read this one next. And I was really glad that I read this. It was a little bit different than I thought it would be. I thought it was gonna focus a lot on our ancestors, the Australopithecus, all of the other sapiens, but instead it focused more on humans, which is fair. Unlike Educated, I don't think I was disappointed. It wasn't super dense and super wordy and written specifically for other academics, but it wouldn't be the first book that I would pick up if you are just getting started into learning about the beginnings of humanity. I think this is a good sort of like in the middle type book, and I really liked it. I had like this feeling that it spent a lot of time on language, but looking back at it, it really didn't. I really liked what it had to say about language. I liked that it didn't spend as much time on genetics and evolution. This was written in 2006. I think a little bit of the information is a little bit outdated. I liked sort of when it stopped and talked about how last names were given down. There was a genetic study done of a bunch of people with the same last name, and it turns out that they are related, which was really cool. And it talked a lot about how we can determine how large populations of people are related. The biggest example it talked about is with Jews, because as this book mentions, Jews have the most studying done on their genetics. It talked a lot about the click languages of the Kung. There's a click in front of it, but I'm not going to try and say it, which was really cool because I have an anthropology book about the Kung, specifically about the Kung woman, so that was really weird when I was reading that. I read this with an audiobook and following along, and I again really liked the audiobook. I'm not gonna lie, I really like when deep voices read me things because I think that is kind of sexy. The audiobook narrator had a very deep voice, and that was just very, very pleasant to listen to. One thing is that sometimes it talks about things that kind of require visuals, and there are some visuals like this, but sometimes I just think there needed to be a little bit more, just to sort of help reinforce the ideas that were being said. Another thing is I kind of wish that it spent more time talking about our cousins, our ancestral cousins, and why it is that we particularly outlived them and why they died. I think this book is a solid 4 out of 5. Books like these really hit the spot for me. I really like them because I find this part of our history very interesting. Yeah, that's this one. Now we're kind of getting into books that I didn't think that I would finish in this month. I did. The next big book that I read purely for pleasure is The Little Princes, One Man's Promise to Bring Home the Lost Children of Nepal by Connor Grennan. I got this book because I thought it looked cool and there was an adorable small child on the page. I really liked it. I think this was my favorite book that I read this month. I listened to this with the audiobook and followed along, and the audiobook is narrated by the author Connor, and I thought that was really cool. I've never really had that experience before. We start off with the book and he talks about sort of his motivations for volunteering at this orphanage called Little Princes. At first it came from a very, very selfish place because he wanted to take this world tour and he wanted to justify it to his parents by volunteering at this orphanage for 2 months. At the beginning, you kind of hate Connor because you're like, Connor, you're a fucking asshole. At first I was like, I don't really know if I'm going to like this book because Connor kind of pissed me off in the beginning. At the beginning he was so nervous and he was so like, I don't know if I'm gonna like this. As the book continues, that completely changes. He falls in love with these children, and once his 2 months finishes, the kids ask him if he's gonna come back, and typically volunteers don't come back, so he was told to tell them that basically he wasn't gonna come back, but he took some time and he was like, I have to come back to these kids because I love them. We told him that he'd come back in a year. He did his world trip around. It was a very short part of the book. He were with his other friends. They're talking about like getting girls and all this other stuff, and I was like, I don't like that. I want to go back to the kiddos, please. Compared to the rest of the book, it was just kind of like, oh, well, that's icky. I don't like that. He decides to go back to the children's home, and then he decides to create his own home for kids in Nepal. He calls it Next Generation Nepal. Its goal is to find children who were taken away from their parents during the Civil War to try and protect them and give them a better life. He opens up this home to find those children and then also reunite them with their parents. He was driven to do this because he promised 7 children that they would be taken care of and go to a safe place, but then these child traffickers got there before the people of this one home could get to them, and they sold them, and he was so distraught over just a really adorable story. The kids in these feel so alive. The kids in this book feel so alive and so real and just so adorable. The kids are so cute. They're so lovable. From the moment you meet them, you fall in love with them over the course of reading this book. From a very personal standpoint, I really identified with his feelings when he was a part of them, where he just felt so lost. and so depressed. All he wanted to do was get back to them so that he could help them, because I kind of went through a similar thing when I was a TA, connected with the feelings that he had towards these kids because it mirrored my feelings that I had towards my students. I had a hard time carrying on and going to school and moving on with my life. So I really identified with this book, even though what I was doing was teaching and what he was doing was something really different. It made this story feel really personal to me. And for those reasons, I'm gonna give this a 5 out of 5. His nonprofit is still up and running. I think I might go check out their website to see if there's other ways that I can support him. I'm so glad I got this, and I read this when I did, and I did not think I was gonna finish this before this month was over, but I read through this really fast. I had such a hard time putting it down. I would literally get to my class and dread turning it off. Thanks. So the very last book I read was 1,000 Miles to Freedom, My Escape from North Korea by Nyusun Kim, with Sebastian Feltini, translated by David Tian. You know, the last book I thought I wasn't going to finish. Well, this one I thought even more that I wasn't going to finish. I read this in 2 days. I finished it literally this morning. The author's journey to get from North Korea to South Korea, where she is currently living. I don't know much of anything about North Korea other than what the media says, which is very little. Hearing what she went through and how hungry she was during the famine, how she dealt with the loss of her father who died in the famine. I thought it was so gripping and so interesting. I thought that the very last chapter was less interesting because it was the epilogue where she talks about how she's doing and how she's spreading her story. I think it's amazing that she has turned out to be such a well-adjusted person given all the abuse that she went through. It's a very short book. It's 228 pages, but the audiobook is only 5 hours. I've read this with audiobook and following along, and it just flew by. I couldn't put it down. It was so gripping the way she tells it. It's something that I didn't know a lot about. My ears just wanted to keep hearing more. Last night I was reading it. I had to force myself to put it down to go to bed. I wholeheartedly would have stayed up another hour just to finish it. It took her 9 years to get to South Korea. I was like, what? How can it take 9 years? It was really compelling. Really surprised I got to this. I'm really glad I did. I'm so glad I picked this up. I picked this up in New York. You're going to see that video later that's coming out in a couple weeks. I have it all edited. I'm actually transcribing right now, working on the captions. So it's basically almost done. I would say pick it up, help support her. I don't know what else to say about this book. It was a good book. If I had to criticize this book, my main criticism would be I wish we spent more time in North Korea and we really spent more time with what it was like over there. I would have liked to know more, you know? I wanted more time in North Korea and I wanted to know more about the society there. Good book. Read it. I'm gonna take a nap now. Thank you guys for sitting through my August wrap-up. I'm so glad you listened to me rambling. Like, subscribe, share, comment. Let me know if you've read any of these books before. What's your favorite book that I read? If you have any questions, any of those general things, let me know in the comments section. I have no idea what's next week. I'll let you guys go on with your merry lives and I should get to doing homework. Oh, I put this cover on dead wrong. Oops.